The Roman Republic was an ever-shifting world of intense competition, grand ambitions, and towering figures whose deeds shaped the destiny of countless people. It was a realm where politicians and generals vied for power on both the battlefield and the marble floors of the Senate. By the middle of the 1st century BC, Rome had already carved out a vast empire stretching from Spain to the Middle East. Yet no amount of territory could calm the growing tumult within its own walls. Ambition and rivalry festered, sowing the seeds of civil war that would soon tear apart the bonds that once held the Republic together. The legendary names involved, Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and others, would transform Rome in ways unimaginable only a generation earlier. Julius Caesar was a name already sparkling with admiration among the people. He had served as governor in various provinces, rising through the ranks with brilliance in rhetoric and unparalleled skill in warfare. Charismatic, intelligent, and driven, Caesar cultivated the favor of Rome's lower classes even as the Senate watched his growing influence with suspicion. He had won significant fame in the Gallic Wars, subduing tribes, crossing rivers once thought uncrossable, and even venturing into Britain, an expedition that captured the imagination of Rome. But no accolades were enough for Caesar. He wanted more. He wanted a place in the uppermost pantheon of Roman leaders, one that transcended the fleeting praises of the crowd. His ambitions, and the manner in which he pursued them, brought him into conflict with the aristocracy, which saw him as a dangerous populist. On the other side stood Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, once Caesar's ally by way of the First Triumvirate, along with the wealthy Marcus Licinius Crassus. Pompey had a storied history of his own, famed for clearing the Mediterranean Sea of pirates in record time, triumphing in campaigns across the East, and returning to Rome, paraded as a conquering hero. He cut a figure of traditional aristocratic leadership, supported by a large faction in the Senate. While Caesar earned the love of the masses, Pompey basked in the esteem of many aristocrats who saw him as a more reliable guardian of the Republic's traditions. Yet their partnership, fragile from the start, unraveled with time as each sought to safeguard personal power. After Crassus's death in the ill-fated Parthian campaign at Carrhae, the balance between the two surviving triumvirs tilted precariously toward inevitable conflict. The Republic was strained to its limit by power blocks, personal vendettas, and the unstoppable momentum of ambition. Propelled by Caesar's military successes and his refusal to bow to senatorial decrees that would strip him of immunity and possibly lead to prosecution, relations in Rome were at a breaking point. The Senate, swayed by Pompey and his allies, ordered Caesar to relinquish command of his forces and return to the city. Caesar, famously, would not submit to this directive, because without the protection of his armies, he would be left vulnerable to political trials. He saw in the Senate's demands not a lawful requirement, but a direct challenge to his dignity and a calculated move to end his career, and possibly his life. In the bitter winter of 49 BC, Caesar made a choice that reverberated through history. At the banks of the Rubicon, the modest river that marked the legal boundary of his province, he paused. Surrounded by loyal legions who had fought by his side through grueling campaigns, he uttered words that would become immortal. Alea iacta est, the die is cast. Then, with resolve burning in his eyes, he led his forces across, effectively declaring war on the Senate and Pompey. This singular act plunged Rome into a civil war that would shape the future of the Mediterranean world. Panic seized the capital. Pompey and many of the senators fled Rome, convinced that Caesar's approach meant inevitable capture or worse. Yet Caesar entered the city almost unopposed. His strategy was bold and his marches swift. He pursued Pompey to take from him the initiative and lay claim to uncontested mastery of Roman lands. Despite initial setbacks, Pompey managed to regroup in the east. He took advantage of his alliances and the resources of Rome's eastern provinces, confident that he could build a force capable of challenging Caesar. Legions flocked to him, including many of Rome's aristocracy, patricians who still believed in the old system, or who simply calculated that Pompey's star would rise again. Caesar, meanwhile, consolidated power in Italy and Spain, dispatching loyal lieutenants to secure different fronts and quell potential uprisings. He moved like lightning to ensure that any advantage Pompey might gain in resources or manpower was short-lived. All the while, the world watched. In every marketplace, forum, and garrison, whispers circulated, Caesar or Pompey? Who would emerge as master of Rome? The year 48 BC arrived with tensions at a boil. Caesar pursued Pompey across the Adriatic Sea, ignoring winter storms and logistical challenges. Skirmishes erupted along the coasts, in ephemeral confrontations that tested both generals' wits. Caesar's hallmark was speed, a tactic that had served him well in Gaul. He attempted to trap Pompey's forces, cornering them so that superior discipline and morale could deliver a decisive blow. Pompey's leadership, bolstered by experienced officers, was equally determined, and he managed to extricate his armies from Caesar's maneuvers, hoping to bring the conflict to a battlefield of his choosing. They danced this dance of lethal strategy until they approached Pharsalus in central Greece, a region of rolling plains, farmland, and scattered hills. It was not so much a place chosen by mutual agreement as a convergence point determined by necessity. Pompey's advisors urged a war of attrition, pointing out that Caesar's supply lines were stretched thin. They suggested smaller engagements, harassment tactics, and the waiting game. These tactics, they believed, would starve Caesar's legions and erode his hold on his men. But Pompey faced pressure from the senators in his camp, nobles who believed that Roman dignity demanded a direct battle, that the Senate must crush Caesar openly to restore order to the Republic. With such influential voices clamoring for immediate action, Pompey eventually conceded, hoping that his larger numbers and the perceived weariness in Caesar's ranks might yield a swift victory. In the days leading up to the confrontation, thousands of tents sprouted across the fields, Roman legionaries on both sides resting uneasily, aware that the next morning might bring either triumph or ruin. As dawn broke over the plains near Pharsalus, the two armies stood arrayed, each tens of thousands strong. Caesar's legions, though outnumbered, were battle-hardened from years of constant campaigning. Many had shared hardships with him in Gaul, stood beneath harsh winters, endured forced marches that boggled the imagination. Their loyalty was tied intimately to Caesar himself, a charismatic leader who walked among the ranks, greeting individual centurions by name, offering encouragement, and reminding them of their past glories. They were outnumbered by perhaps 2 to 1, or so some accounts claimed, yet they possessed an iron discipline forged over years of unity in the field. Pompey, in contrast, fielded an impressive army drawn from across the Roman world, seasoned legions from the east, cavalry contingents from noble families, and auxiliaries who swelled his ranks with a variety of fighting styles. His cavalry wing, in particular, outmatched Caesar's in sheer numbers. Roman warfare often hinged upon the interplay of infantry lines locking shields and exchanging blows, while cavalry circled to envelop the flanks. Pompey's plan hinged on the idea that his superior cavalry force would swiftly break Caesar's flank, turning the tide of battle in a dramatic pincer movement. It was a bold plan, one that capitalized on strengths and hammered home the advantage in numbers. Throughout the morning hours, the two generals made last-minute adjustments. Caesar, observing Pompey's dispositions, concealed a specially trained group of infantry on his flank, instructing them to guard against the inevitable cavalry charge. He knew that if his flank collapsed under Pompey's cavalry, the entire line would fold. To counter that threat, Caesar had these hidden cohorts prepared to launch javelins at the oncoming horsemen, targeting not just the men, but the faces of the animals, a strategy that might sow panic in the heart of the cavalry. This was unorthodox and extremely risky. If it failed, Caesar's men would be trampled. Yet, if it succeeded, it might neutralize Pompey's key advantage. A hush spread across the field of Pharsalus as the legions braced themselves. Shields were gripped tighter, swords unsheathed with the metallic rasp that presaged violence. Standards emblazoned with Roman eagles fluttered in the wind, while each side peered across the short distance separating them from their former comrades. When the battle commenced, it was as though a thunderclap rolled across the plains. War horns bellowed, officers shouted commands, and legions advanced steadily behind a forest of spears. Clouds of dust rose under the pounding of thousands of sandaled feet. In the middle, the infantry lines crashed in a maelstrom of shields, swords, and spears. The world, for those involved, shrank to the patch of ground beneath their feet, and the immediate threat before their eyes. On Caesar's left flank, Pompey's cavalry surged forward with confidence. Gleaming helmets and armor reflected the sunlight in a dazzling display as the mounted troops charged, determined to sweep aside any opposition. At first, Caesar's cavalry, fewer in number, gave ground, luring the larger force onward. Then, at Caesar's signal, the concealed cohorts rushed out in tight formation. These were veteran infantry, drilled in the use of the pilum, throwing spears with lethal range. At the critical moment, they hurled their pila straight into the faces of horses and riders alike. The effect was devastating. Horses reared and tossed their riders. Men screamed as they felt the shock of spears piercing armor and flesh. Disorder rippled through Pompey's cavalry. What was to be a triumphant sweep through Caesar's flank collapsed into chaos. Sensing the momentum swing, Caesar ordered his own cavalry to countercharge, seizing the advantage from Pompey's wavering horsemen. Panic set in among the latter, and they began to retreat, leaving Pompey's left wing dangerously exposed. The infantry in that section, expecting cavalry support, now faced the harrowing prospect of a flank attack. Caesar's men pressed forward, fueled by the confidence gained from repelling Pompey's prized cavalry. The intensity of battle grew with every heartbeat, as if the fates themselves hovered overhead, uncertain of which side to favor. In the center, legions on both sides fought fiercely, bodies piling up, dust caking the sweat on men's brows. Shouts of wounded soldiers, the clash of steel, the frantic instructions of centurions, these melded into a single chorus of chaos. Roman fought Roman, each side believing in its cause and its general. The sheer heartbreak of civil war was evident in moments where old comrades recognized one another across the lines, forced to cross swords or risk being struck down themselves. Above this swirl of horror and bravery, Caesar's calm presence radiated confidence. He could be seen riding among his troops, encouraging them, pointing to vulnerabilities in Pompey's lines, and reminding them of how far they had come together. Pompey, for his part, had begun the day hopeful of a decisive triumph. His scouts and advisors had assured him that Caesar's smaller force would crack under the relentless pressure. But as he watched his cavalry wing melt away, and then saw Caesar's cohorts roll up the flank, he grasped the dire potential unfolding. Some accounts say he retreated to his tent, paralyzed by the sudden turn of fortune, while others suggest he tried to rally his men but could not staunch the growing panic. Whatever the truth, the effect was the same. Once Pompey's cavalry was neutralized, Caesar's legions began a coordinated push that drove deep into Pompey's ranks. The pressure became overwhelming. Pompey's line buckled, and in pockets across the battlefield, men threw down their arms and fled. The once disciplined ranks descended into a disorderly mass of desperate individuals seeking an exit from the carnage. Caesar's pursuit was merciless, yet he also offered clemency to those who surrendered, true to the generous spirit he had often shown. He knew that Rome's future hinged not simply on victory, but on how he treated those who had opposed him. Sensing total defeat, Pompey himself abandoned the battlefield, riding off with a small retinue to seek refuge, first heading toward Larissa, then onward to the coast. The sun climbed higher in the Greek sky as the magnitude of the outcome sank in. Caesar had emerged victorious in one of the most decisive battles in Rome's long history. Pharsalus was drenched in blood by the battle's end. Thousands lay dead or dying across the field, forming a tragic testament to a civil war where Romans slew Romans. Caesar personally oversaw the treatment of the wounded, including some of Pompey's men, while also accepting the surrender of survivors. His legions, though exhausted, were buoyed by the knowledge that they had overcome a daunting numerical disadvantage to seal Caesar's ascendancy. Historians would later frame the encounter as a textbook example of Caesar's adaptability, clarity of strategy, and unshakable bond with his troops. Yet, the immediate aftermath revealed that victory in battle did not immediately grant Caesar undisputed control. Pompey still lived, and significant pockets of opposition remained. Many senators, convinced that Caesar's victory would usher in tyranny, fled to allied states, raising the specter of future resistance. Pompey, whose star had so abruptly fallen, wandered across the Mediterranean in search of support. He pinned his last hopes on the Eastern kingdoms, especially Egypt, governed by the ambitious Ptolemaic dynasty. The illusions of a glorious comeback quickly disintegrated. Upon Pompey's arrival in Egypt, he was betrayed and assassinated, an act perpetrated by local authorities who hoped to curry favor with Caesar. The once mighty Pompey the Great was reduced to a casualty of political expediency, his end a grim reflection of Rome's violent power struggles. When Caesar arrived in Egypt shortly thereafter, it is said that he was presented with Pompey's severed head. Far from rejoicing, Caesar reportedly wept for the death of his longtime rival and one-time ally, lamenting the loss of so distinguished a Roman to such treachery. He later involved himself in the complex local politics of Egypt, supporting Cleopatra VII in her bid to rule jointly with her brother, Ptolemy XIII. The Egyptian interlude would become legendary for Caesar's liaison with Cleopatra, an affair that sparked countless stories and grand illusions about East and West. Still, Caesar never wavered from the broader goal of consolidating power throughout the Roman realm. The significance of Pharsalus was more than a mere struggle between two powerful generals. It was a watershed event that irrevocably altered the governance of Rome. Though Caesar styled himself as a champion of Roman values, many worried that his unprecedented authority pushed the Republic toward autocracy. In the wake of his victory, Caesar pardoned many who had opposed him, including high-profile senators. This move was a political statement as well as a moral one. Clemency was a means to bind former enemies to him, to unify Rome under his leadership, and to position himself as both conqueror and peacemaker. However, not everyone was ready to forget or forgive. Seeds of resentment lingered, destined to bloom into a conspiracy that would one day culminate in his assassination on the Ides of March. But in the moment after Pharsalus, Caesar was unstoppable. He returned to Rome a triumphant leader, receiving near-universal acclamation. The city was decorated with arches and bustling with festivities. The people, weary of prolonged civil strife, saw in him a chance for stability and peace. They turned out in droves to witness his triumphal processions and to bask in the spectacle of a victorious general who had, in their eyes, subdued both foreign enemies and rebellious Romans. The Senate, half cowed and half resigned, granted Caesar honors befitting a dictator. Though the constitutional structures were still formally in place, power now radiated from one man's persona. Beyond the pomp of official ceremonies lay deeper changes in Roman society. Caesar introduced numerous reforms, overhauling the calendar, distributing land to veterans, expanding citizenship privileges to provincial communities that had supported him. He laid the foundations for many improvements that would outlive him, forging a legacy that was as administrative as it was military. Some saw these reforms as progressive steps that aligned with the evolving nature of the empire. Others perceived them as cracks in the foundation of the traditional republican order. Debates about Caesar's intentions raged in the taverns and homes of Rome, with some praising his brilliance and others denouncing what they saw as authoritarian overreach. Yet the shadow of Pharsalus still hung over the Republic, a reminder of how fragile and precious unity was. The battlefield of Pharsalus had shattered illusions of a stable, senator-led Rome and ushered in a world where the control of the legions and the loyalty they offered to a charismatic leader meant everything. It was a turning point that not only cost countless lives, but also recast the very definition of Roman politics. Caesar's famous commentaries, though never shy about his achievements, diplomatically cast Pompey in a sympathetic light, a nuance that suggested Caesar was aware that the memory of civil strife needed some measure of healing. Still, pockets of resistance continued under leaders like Cato the Younger, who believed in the purity of republican ideals and refused to bend the knee to Caesar's rule. In North Africa, and later in Hispania, further battles were fought, culminating in more bloodshed. None of these clashes, however, could rival the decisive blow struck at Pharsalus, where Pompey's grand army had once seemed certain to deliver a final defeat upon the smaller force of Caesar. Each new confrontation simply reaffirmed that Caesar's hold on power would not be easily dislodged. In the homes of Roman citizens, stories circulated about the day's events at Pharsalus. Some recalled how the sky was especially clear at dawn, how the dust clouds cloaked the battlefield, or how Caesar's voice rallied his men at the critical hour. Others spoke of Pompey's anxious face, how the once proud general seemed to waver before committing to the battle that would mark his downfall. Many foot soldiers, if they survived, carried the scars, physical and emotional, of having fought against their countrymen. The Civil War had effectively ended the era of illusions about Rome's republic as a stable, shared entity. Instead, it became clear that might and personal loyalty could trump the institutional checks once thought unassailable. As Caesar tightened his grip on Rome, new horizons opened for him. Not content simply with Civil War victories, he planned campaigns into the East, including an involvement in the complex politics of the Parthian Empire. His vision was that of a Mediterranean fully under Roman sway, possibly extending deeper into the East than any prior Roman had ventured. Yet all of these aspirations, all the ceremonies and reorganization, would soon meet a swift and brutal end on the Ides of March 44 BC, when senators who feared the concentration of power in one man conspired to assassinate him. The irony was stark. Caesar, who had endeavored to show clemency at every turn, fell victim to the violence he sought to quell. Even in death, Caesar's influence did not wane. His adoptive heir, Octavian, later Augustus, would invoke Caesar's name and memory to rally support, ultimately triumphing over the last vestiges of republican opposition. The shift from republic to empire was thus sealed, a transformation that might have been unthinkable without the events at Pharsalus. Indeed, this single battle's significance cannot be overstated. It not only determined who held the reins of power in 48 BC, but it permanently altered the course of Roman governance, paving the way for a line of emperors. Reflecting upon Pharsalus, historians throughout the ages have emphasized the drama of the confrontation. The clamor of weapons, the dust swirling around legionaries, the fear and bravery displayed by both sides. They've also emphasized Caesar's tactical genius and Pompey's fatal hesitation. But the intangible effects, the way it spelled doom for the Republic's traditional order, loom equally large. Never again would Rome convincingly rebuild the checks and balances that once characterized its political life. The triumphant eagles that soared above Caesar's legionaries on that fateful day became the heralds of a new Rome, one oriented around a single supreme leader. For those who walked the field after the battle, the tragedy was glaringly evident. Roman men who had once saluted the same flag lay dead at each other's hands. Grief settled in the camps as old friends discovered that the fortunes of allegiance had pitched them into lethal opposition. Many private acts of mourning took place, with survivors offering last rites or simple words of farewell for the fallen. Caesar, for his part, recognized the magnitude of the devastation. He took measures to bury the dead with honors and allowed families to reclaim bodies. Some accounts say he even wept at the sight of so much Roman blood spilled over the ambitions of a few. In the following weeks, Caesar worked to assert control over the Greek cities and provinces that had sided with Pompey, seeking to restore stability. Some of these communities braced for harsh reprisals. Instead, Caesar displayed clemency, understanding that mercy now could translate into loyalty later. Strategic generosity was as much a part of Caesar's arsenal as the legion and the sword. To secure a lasting peace, he needed the cooperation of local elites and the acceptance of a war-weary populace. In every city he entered, his presence signaled the unstoppable ascendancy of a leader who had beaten the odds at Pharsalus. Despite the outward signs of reconciliation, the Roman aristocrats who had escaped to Africa, Hispania, or other corners of the empire did not rest. They continued to organize resistance, forging alliances with local rulers who feared Caesar's influence might eventually overshadow their own. Notably, Cato the Younger and Metellus Scipio gathered forces in Africa. Caesar, fresh from subduing Greek territories and dealing with the complexities in Egypt, turned his attention to these new threats, leading to further conflicts such as the Battle of Pharsalus. Each of these engagements came as an echo of Pharsalus. The unstoppable wave that Caesar had unleashed in Greece seemed determined to claim victory wherever it went. Yet even among Caesar's allies and closest associates, tension brewed. Men like Mark Antony and others who had been loyal began to accumulate their own spheres of influence, sowing seeds of future rivalries. The civil war's outcome at Pharsalus may have determined the immediate victor, but the broader question of Rome's leadership remained fraught. The old republic was gone. In its place stood a nascent system of individual rule that would soon become the Roman Empire. The path from a triumphant general to a stable succession of emperors was not straightforward. Future generations would remember how Caesar's brilliance and Pompey's downfall cleared the way for transformations that shaped centuries to come. In later eras, dramatists, poets, and scholars revisited Pharsalus, turning it into a focal point of philosophical reflection on ambition, power, and fate. They saw Pompey's downfall as a cautionary tale about underestimating a determined rival, or perhaps about placing too much faith in numbers alone. They revered Caesar's brilliance, but also pondered the moral and ethical costs of civil war. Indeed, the entire saga, Rubicon to Pharsalus to Cleopatra, became the stuff of legends, a story that enthralled anyone who came across it. Modern minds continue to mull over these events, attempting to glean lessons about leadership, strategy, and the precarious balance between personal ambition and the common good. And so, the battle at Pharsalus stands as a testament to a single day's power to reshape centuries of history. Though the Republic had not been the bastion of purity that some later romanticized, it nonetheless functioned as a complex system of checks, balances, and shared power that had steered Rome's course for centuries. Pharsalus, more than any other battle of the Civil War, symbolized the irreversible shift toward one-man rule. Even those who once cried out for the restoration of senatorial authority had to concede the ground to the unstoppable tide of Caesar's success. In the broader tapestry of Rome's civil wars, Pharsalus was the crucial pivot. Had Pompey emerged victorious, the narrative of Rome's future might have been drastically different. The entire structure of Roman governance, the shape of its empire, and the fate of countless individuals hung in the balance that dawn in 48 BC. With Caesar's victory, the mold was cast for what would evolve into the Roman Empire, under the aegis of a dynasty of emperors who claimed Caesar as their forerunner, even taking his name as a title. In that sense, Pharsalus was not merely a decisive battle, but the dawn of a new epoch. Yet the tragedy of Romans fighting Romans and the division it wrought stands as a stark reminder of how swiftly a republic can slide into civil strife when political ambitions outweigh collective well-being. Pharsalus captures this clash with brutal clarity: the hopes and fears of those who marched, the strategic brilliance of a determined leader, and the inexorable turning of fate's wheel that raised one man to unassailable power while dashing another. That day, thousands of souls shed blood on Greek soil, forging a memory that would endure in the annals of history. In the end, the Battle of Pharsalus was both an ending and a beginning. An ending to the old order that had reigned over Rome for centuries, and a beginning of the epoch of strong rulers who commanded legions and defined the state by their own persona. Caesar might not have lived long enough to see every consequence of his victory, but the seeds he planted shaped an empire that, at its height, spanned continents and influenced the course of Western civilization for millennia. And so, when reflecting upon Pharsalus, one cannot escape the sense that this was the hinge upon which Rome's destiny pivoted, where the brightest star of the old republic was snuffed out, and a new dawn, gleaming with imperial ambition, rose beneath the sun.